Hi, we continue in Genesis 35 today as we reach near the end of the entire Jacob story. And what I think of as an epilogue here at the end of chapter 35, as you can see on the right side of the screen, coming down to this end. And although I ended here, we will continue through chapter 36 for the genealogy of Esau's descendants, although they're not connected to Jacob, so that's not really part of the Jacob story, but it certainly is part of this unit, as we'll see. And if you've ever watched a movie that for most of the film focuses on a certain point in people's lives and then at the very end flashes forward to a couple of distant points in the future, that's really what we see here. Because if we look at our chapter 35 here, as you can see with the key words and other elements here, including this chiasm that we looked at, this first part is really the end of the unit that we've been exploring throughout this whole section from 33:18 through 35:7 here, because this chiasm, as we've been noting, is parallel to the end of chapter 33 and really completes that whole unit. And what we looked at last time in this section here is really repetition of what we saw before, whether we think of it as a new event or simply a repetition of the earlier things that we saw with Jacob in chapter 28 and echoing what we saw with Abraham in chapter 17. Those are really just summaries to highlight that the promises made by either El or Yahweh to Jacob's father and grandfather will continue to be valid here. And what we have now, though, is not about the past. And you notice how in these sections I had bracketed the various elements of looking back that it echoed. Here, there's nothing looking back, because this is the death of Rachel and the birth of Benjamin, and plainly neither of those things have happened yet. And yet, in it, there's almost no response from Jacob. And if we read that as character, then it seems Jacob is cold and indifferent to the death of his beloved wife. I'd like to suggest it's not about character. This is just simply a report. There are no feelings made about anybody, even as we'll see the one described here as a midwife telling Rachel not to be afraid. We hear nothing about how Rachel's actually feeling at all, and we hear nothing about anybody crying or any mourning at all. So it's simply a report. And as we'll see in the last video for this section, similarly with the shocking reunion of Jacob and Esau to bury their father Isaac, we can only imagine the amount of pathos that it would be both for Jacob and Esau to be together, but also for Jacob and Isaac to be together, but also to Isaac have his two sons there together for the first time since they were young adults way back in chapter 27. And yet there's nothing. And so these are just the camera looking out at a distance where we can barely see the characters except to know that things have happened to close the story. Later, perhaps centuries later, other authors made what we think of as the Joseph story, starting in chapter 37, and Jacob will become a character again. But I'd like to suggest that the authors of the Jacob cycle we've been looking at through this unit here, from chapter 25 to 35, know nothing about that. So this is really the end of the Jacob story, although it doesn't include a death notice for him any more than the death notice for Isaac was in the Isaac story, of which there isn't really. The death notice for Isaac, as I was just noting, is here in chapter 35. So we'll put the key words up as we go. Another thing we've been looking at, though, I looked at last time, which has a certain key element here, are these connections between our passage and the story in Judges 19 to 21 about the rape of the secondary wife of the Levite and what happens to the Benjaminites. And then similarly with Ruth, the echo here of Ephrathites in Bethlehem. And I might as well just say here while I'm on this, before we get to the verses here, what's at issue are two places that are merged in this into one. Ephrath, which is a town, either equivalent to Bethlehem, as we hear in our passage here, Ephrath, that is Bethlehem, or a town in Judah. And that's really one of the questions. Is Ephrath in the place known as Benjamin, or is Ephrath in the place known as Judah? That would not seem to be much of an issue for us, but plainly that was an issue for later people who were in the exile trying to reconstruct after the Persians had defeated the Babylonians, what will now be called Judah and Israel. But at the time had the tribal designations, as we can see here. And so we can see we've been following Jacob here from Sukkoth and from Shechem here and down to Bethel. And then we notice to get to Bethlehem here, he's got to pass through Benjamin. And this is solitary territory, as we've been seeing in my Samuel series, and we've been looking at a number of the parallels and connections between the Saul-David story and the story of Jacob and all the rest of Genesis. And yet none of these things are named as they pass through here. Bethel is named, and yet then down to Jerusalem here, and which isn't also named. It's because it's not Jerusalem yet. It's Jebus. It's Jebus even in the time of David, because the Jebusites lived there. So this map is a little anachronistic to have Jerusalem there. But it certainly mentions Bethlehem, as we can see in our passage here on the left side right there. And Beersheba, which is where Jacob started his journey, all the way down here. But what we can also see on this map, which we can't see on the other one exactly, is the place where Jacob is intending to go here, to where his father is. Marked here as Hebron, but also named as Mamre or Kiriath Arba. So he'd have to go past here to get to Beersheba, and we'll see in the next video he gets to here and never gets back to Beersheba. So if we look on the map that we've been following that doesn't have the tribal elements, but simply has fitting the context of the time, just simply the land of Canaan, we can see that here. But here we don't get the issue of Benjamin being the thematic question. So that's a part of what's at issue here. And as you can see, going back to this map for a moment, Ephraim here as a territory would be anachronistic in this time period, because Ephraim will be named as the Egyptian-born son of Joseph. And Joseph is born, but he's not a main character yet, and obviously he's still a child. In chapter 37, we to the Joseph story, we'll be told he's 17. And so Ephraim certainly isn't born yet, so it can't be noted. And yet the issue of Bethlehem as Ephrath is a different place than Ephraim. Are those meant to be the same or similar? They're plainly not the same. Ephraim is a tribal territory, but one could ask, why is there not a Joseph territory? Why is there Ephraim and Manasseh named for Jacob's grandchildren and not his sons? And that I can't answer. But we see here that the story in Judges begins by juxtaposing the hill country of Ephraim with the woman from Bethlehem. So even though it's not Ephrath, as it is here in Ruth and as it here in Genesis, it certainly seems like it's echoing in all three situations the question of whether Rachel is born, or is buried rather, in a Benjamin territory or in Judah territory, and what that means about Jacob, Mr. Israel, for Judah after the exile. A question that we won't get into detail here. So let's just go back to our passage, and we'll jump right into our story here. And I note that we're told in the beginning, you can see it on the right side of the screen here, that chapter 35 began with the command from El, arise and go up to Bethel and settle there. And he's been there, and we just saw in the last verse 15 from last video, Jacob called the place where God had spoken with him Bethel, echoing his naming that in chapter 28. Then they journeyed from Bethel. And how do we explain they journeyed from Bethel when that was the place that El told him to settle? You can either do it, as my note below suggests, to nuance settling as not really meaning settling, but just being there long enough to make the altar. But what's the point of that? Why would he need to make an altar in a place he'd already made an altar? And why use the word for settling to do that? Why not just go to Bethel and make an altar and then continue? But he just continues. So we have to wonder whether Jacob is still not listening to the voice that just told him a few verses ago to go to Bethel and settle there. And why he's going on, it's hard to know. But there he is going on. So they journeyed from Bethel, and while they were still some distance from Ephrath, Westerman notes that the phrase here, Kivrath, Haaretz meaning the land, Kivrath is an unknown measure of distance. So we don't know why, but it's highlighting they're not at Ephrath, but they're going in that direction. Is that their goal, or is it simply saying that's the closest town and there's nobody around to help her? Either way, it's mentioned here for the first time. Will be mentioned again in 48:7. Let's look at that there, where Jacob in the Joseph story near the end recalls exactly what we see here, verse for verse, and that's where Manasseh and Ephraim are. And we get to that story, we'll see how Joseph is upset that Jacob switches his hands to give the younger the paternal blessing, much like he got from his father, but in a different way. So we'll get to that when we get there. And so that we hear suddenly that Rachel is in childbirth. And when was the last time we heard from Rachel? we realize we haven't seen or heard from Rachel since Jacob paraded his family before Esau back a few chapters ago. And we'd not heard from her hardly at all. And we don't hear a word from her here. We don't know what she's feeling, what she's thinking. We don't hear anything about the pain she's in except from the narrator. Nothing from her at all. So she's really written off here. As I was noting at the beginning of this video, it's really just a factual report. The phrase for childbirth here, Baudelaire here, is literally bringing a child, and the word for midwife and hard labor are all related to this here. So there's a word, an assonance element in the Hebrew we can't get here in the English. As Sarna notes, the fact that she's in childbirth, he says, a subtle announcement of the falsehood of the way of women at Laban in 31:35, where she said she couldn't get up off the saddle because the way of women was upon her. We knew at the time that it wasn't true, not because we knew her menstrual cycle, but because we knew she was lying about having the teraphim under her saddle. But now, plainly not a year later, although we don't know that. It could have been that he was settled in the house at Succoth for some longer period of time that we weren't told. But Sarna's assuming that it's been only a few months and that she's been pregnant within the time period of when she left her father. But we don't know that for sure. And she had hard labor. And using a phrase here that's only in the recollection in 48, and it's the only labor we hear. And it's a very interesting thing because we saw the 4 women who had 12 children, and we've obviously seen other children being born. And even though childbirth was the single biggest cause of premature death for women until the modern era, it really with cesarean sections in the 20th century, we hear of none of the women dying in childbirth, and we hear of nobody dying of illness anywhere in the book of Genesis. It's as if they're especially blessed with good health and long life, and we'll see just how long life with Isaac in the next video, but not for Rachel. And so she was in her hard labor, and notice the repetition here in the Hebrew, when she was in her hard labor, as my note below has from Fleming. Benjamin has his own location of birth, the only son who was homegrown in the future land, and his birth is tied to Rachel's death, which is marked by a shrine in Bethlehem. And here you can see the image of Rachel's tomb, although we don't know literally whether that's the place or not from the story, and yet it's been revered that way for a long time. As my note below has, the only other death in childbirth in the entire Hebrew Bible is Phinehas' wife in the beginning of 1 Samuel, the descendants of Eli there. So when she was in a hard labor, the midwife, or Hameladeth here in PL, notice the Yeled here for a baby there. One could say the child bringer, says to her, "Do not be afraid, even though we did not know that Rachel is afraid." Again, we hear nothing about her. "For now you will have another son." I don't know how that would be consoling if she's in hard labor and dying. Having another son would not either reduce the pain or the prospect of her dying. Perhaps it would give her some sense of reason for dying, or perhaps it's all that the woman in this hard situation could say. Ironically, she dies before the wish is fulfilled in 30:24, where she said to Jacob, "Give me children or I will die." And ironically, she dies while having a child. As always, when the New RSV in the Hebrew Bible translates nephesh as soul, it's just flat wrong. There is no concept of soul in Jewish theology then or now, and certainly not in the Hebrew Bible. Nephesh means being or the essence of oneself. It's the part of oneself that's alive because the Spirit of God is in it. So it's not the Greek sense, it's something that could survive death. So the image of her soul's departing is just flat wrong, and very misleading because it makes it sound like it's consistent with later Christian Platonic views, and it's simply not. Departing here, though, means departing in the infinite construction here, just as Abram was called to depart the land and the servant is called to depart here. So really their being was leaving here. And in the process of dying, she named him Ben-Oni, literally son of my sorrow, but it could also be son of my strength, as it would be echoed in 49:3. But his father, notice not Jacob or not Israel, not her husband, none of that, just simply his father. And he'll be Jacob again in the next verses, and he was just Jacob above, but the abstraction here of the father, called him Benjamin, literally son of on my right hand, which referring to the south. As Westerman notes, Jacob's exertion of control at Rachel's deathbed underscores his slimy character, or, quote, perhaps because he's afraid that it could be an evil omen for the child. But of course we know nothing about either of those, whether it's slimy character or an evil omen. We know nothing about why he made that choice because the narrator simply doesn't tell us. But Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg cites the medieval Midrashist Ramban to note that Jacob translated Oni as pain or strength into goodness and strength. quote, "It is the very nature of holiness to translate pain into strength." That from Gottlieb Zornberg herself. So that's a playful midrashic element there, but that's what the midrash does. And how is Jacob feeling about this, losing his beloved wife? We hear nothing. And the fact that the writers seem to run out of steam here, maybe their scroll was full, it's hard to know. Wouldn't readers like to have something pointed here at this scene, but we hear nothing about it. We just simply hear the flat element, so Rachel died and she was buried. But my notes have various things from commentators who will have something to say. So from Miguel de la Torres here, we have Jacob's curse that whoever stole Laban's idols would surely die has come to pass. As Shea Held notes, in a painfully ironic twist, Rachel, who had insisted she would die if she did not have sons, now dies in the very process of having one. And Cox and Ackerman more recently ask why Jacob didn't take her the 20 miles to Machpelah, where he demands his own bones should go all the way from Egypt in chapter 49. And they bring in the question of Joseph's bones at Shechem, a center for, quote, Joseph tribes Ephraim and Manasseh, and note the segmented genealogy of Jacob's sons, which is to say, separated by the motherhoods, putting her bones in Benjamin or Judah, the point I was making earlier about the questions raised here. They also suggest that death and childbirth, often from other cultures, isolates the mother's body from the community, as we might see from 35:27 below when Jacob arrives at Mamre. Not about the death, but that he arrives there. But we just simply don't know. They're doing what many readers would want to do about wondering about this, but we simply don't know. And the fact that it allow her just to be buried somehow on the way, why doesn't he arrange for a permanent place like Abraham did for Sarah in chapter 23? We got a whole chapter about how to acquire the burial cave that, interestingly, Jacob's own bones will end up back in, and Abraham and Sarah's are in, and Isaac's will be in. And so the fact that Jacob doesn't ever want to go back and pick up these bones, Saul in the books of Samuel are buried in one place, but then David takes the bones back to a more noble and respected place. So that's just a hole here about why Jacob would not want to honor the bones and the body of his beloved wife, but all we can do is guess. So she was buried here. The word for buried is 28 times in Genesis, and it's a third time in this chapter, really highlighting the end of the story. The last was precisely the burial of Sarah that we saw in 23 and of Abraham in 25, really setting this up as a memorial and as a contrast. And this is where it equates Ephrath and Bethlehem, as you can see here. The others refer to Bethlehem and Judah, and some scholars have tried to suggest there's a different Bethlehem in Benjamin that perhaps is this one, and that's severed from the Bethlehem in Judah. But if so, there's never a Bethlehem in Benjamin named as such, and so that's just speculation. And so we get to our final verse for today, and we wonder, where is Leah for her sister's death? Jacob set up the pillar at the grave, and where are her children? Dinah may have been sexually abused and therefore not be valuable to another man in a patriarchal culture, but certainly she would think that her stepmother would be somebody worth memorializing here, and Joseph, we just simply don't know where they are. It's really unfortunate that we don't have that detail. But he set up a pillar at her grave here, and we saw that similar to what we saw in chapter 28 and in 31. And at her grave here, the word only mentioned again for the recollection in 47. It's the pillar of Rachel's tomb, which, as I note here, is referenced in 1 Samuel 10 as the place that Samuel tells Saul to go to see if he can follow instructions, and is there to this day, whether that's to the time of exile, which I've been taking as the time of the audience, exile, or the Persian period after, is hard to say. And interestingly, there's in a chapter that's full of theirs, as I've been highlighting throughout, there's no there in this particular place. The only other places recalled is in Jeremiah, where it's associated with Ramah, which is interesting because you can't really see it on this map. It's up in this area here. Actually, you could see it better on this map. Here it is, where Samuel's home, and that's near the area, but that's not down here. That's suggesting very clearly in the Jeremiah view that Rachel's burial place was in the tribal region of Benjamin. So different biblical sources have different answers to the question. As I've been noting throughout, the Bible is not one simple, clear voice with a simple simple, clear answer, but a symphony of various voices with many different answers to various questions. And so we'll pick it up next time with Jacob going to meet his brother and share in the burial of their father Isaac. See you then for the end of the Jacob cycle. Bye-bye.